Cool. Now our webinar of today has officially started. I'll just give it another minute for people to join, and then we can officially kick off. But for those who are already dropping in, thanks a lot. I see the number of participants is slowly getting up. Maybe just in terms of structure and like what we'll be covering, kind of like our agenda. Before I start with the intros. Of course, like the intro is always first. Like then I'll hand over to Dennis to give us a bit more insights. Do a bit of a deep dive already into like what the changes in the U.S. immigration mean. The new administration, kind of like the implications on immigration, everything around. And then we start with the officially moderated part by me and just like go through some questions. In the end, important for everyone, maybe we'll also have some time for a Q&A. So get your questions ready. You can already like drop questions in the Q&A section at any point. If they are, maybe also they are suited for like some of the topics that we're touching already, and like then we would already incorporate them. So I think like they're getting your inputs would be great. But yeah, maybe now diving into the official part and like starting with the intro. My name is Hannah. I'm one of the 3 founders of Localize. Now we've been working in and around immigration for the last 7 years. It's been an exciting time, of course, like everything. We founded right before COVID. Doing immigration during COVID, where borders were closed, was an interesting challenge as a young company. And then, of course, like all the changes that we've seen in the last years. So I'm personally very, very excited to be here, and also about everything that I can learn in the next 60 minutes. Today, we'll specifically dive into the evolving US immigration landscape under the new administration, potential impact on global mobility strategies, on the way that companies operate, and the changes on overall talent mobility. Because, of course, like the US also, from a global perspective, is a super important both like destination, but also a place where people come from. So that's our focus for today. Very excited for everyone to be here. And now, first, a big welcome to my panelists today. And would love to hand over to them, have them share a little bit about their current roles, their backgrounds, and also what excites them about global mobility. Sharon, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Hannah. So my name is Sharon Lyon. I've been working in the global mobility space for over 20 years now, both in-house roles and consulting roles. Most recently, I've been working with a Swedish headquartered business called Enride. So it's a freight technology company which provides electric and autonomous transport solutions for our clients. In that role, I've been responsible for all aspects of global mobility. So that includes immigration globally, but also relocations and transfers, business travel, remote and flexible work, any sort of cross-border employment arrangements. So anything international and employee related has come across my desk, basically. So a very broad, varied and interesting role. And in terms of background on me, originally from the UK, I've lived in Sweden for almost 7 years before relocating myself and my family to Austin, Texas, almost 2 years ago now. So I can definitely share the pain with my expats of going through US visa processes. Both I've done an L1 and then also got a green card. So I've done the temporary and the permanent routes. Can definitely empathize with that.
So it's very good. So you have like a very, very broad perspective, and I think like they're very interested to see like what your perspectives are that we're hearing later on. Over to you, Carolyn.
Hey everyone, I am Carolyn Volosek. I work for Cox Automotive. However, my team supports the broader Cox Enterprises. So we are headquartered in Atlanta. Cox Automotive deals with all things automotive. So all of the technology that your auto dealers work with, autotrader.com. So we have online vehicle sales, financing, as well as our Mannheim auto auctions where dealers can purchase cars off the auction line and then sell them in their lots. Cox Communications is a US telecommunications provider, right? So we provide phone, cable, internet, mobile services, cloud hosting services, as well as some other technology related services. And then we have Cox Enterprises and our newly created division, Cox Farms. We are the largest operator of greenhouse grown produce in the United States. One of our new ventures, as well as some other areas. So my team oversees all things global mobility and immigration. So we are responsible for U.S. domestic as well as global immigration, our relocation programs, international transfers, international assignments. So similar to Sharon, we're in a similar boat. All of our global remote work requests, we work with business travelers, tax, and then as well as that, we work and manage our PEO relationship for employees that need to work outside of their home country in a location where we don't have an entity. So those are the things that we work with and manage. I've been in the industry for over 20 years now. And it's exciting. The question, what excites you? This topic of immigration it is exciting. It's a difficult conversation, but I think it allows global mobility and immigration practitioners to get really creative in how they problem solve and help the business that we support move forward, given the challenges that we're working on.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And it's also very interesting because, of course, with the breadth of like topics that the companies or like the different parts of the business work with, like that also comes with probably like different jobs and like different types of people that you're relocating, which like just adds another dimension. So also very curious to hear your perspective. But now handing over to Dennis for your intro, but like then I'll also directly let you weave it into maybe like your take and like giving us a bit more of the in-depth view on the changes of the new administration. So over to you, intro first, and like then we'll also share some slides afterwards. And also thanks for being here, everyone.
That sounds good. Thank you, Hannah. So my name is Dennis Hall, Supervising Immigration Counsel with Boundless Immigration. Boundless Immigration is a full-service immigration firm that specializes in family-based immigration as well as corporate U.S. inbound immigration. I've been operating in this space for about 10 years now, primarily helping Fortune 100 companies obviously support their employees for temporary work in the U.S., navigating the green card process, but also helping them iterate and improve their immigration programs overall. And most importantly, with Boundless, we've had a unique opportunity to work with companies that are more venture capital backed or seed companies that are more infant in their broadness and their awareness, and helping them get started and really get a comfortable footing within the corporate immigration land space. And really what I wanted to take some time to go over today is really what's going to be happening with the legal immigration community. And more specifically, we want to go over what are the challenges that we'll be seeing as it relates to the new administration, the new incoming administration. And truthfully told, there is certainly a lot to cover, but really what we wanted to go over is what the changes that we are expecting with the incoming administration. What are the key takeaways and recent developments that we're noticing in corporate immigration as a whole right now? And more importantly, in the future, what mobility and legal teams can do to be better prepared for this incoming immigration landscape. So regarding the new executive orders, obviously, with regards to the new executive orders, we've already seen a lot of changes and a lot of signing of various executive orders from the current administration. And in regards to this slew of executive orders, we're starting to see different parts of family-based immigration, as well as corporate immigration being challenged in different ways. So some of the executive orders that we've seen recently include the Southern Border Emergency, which activates funding by Congress to provide additional funds to the southern border. The Migrant Protection Protocols, also known as the Remain in Mexico program. So essentially individuals applying for asylum applications to the US are effectively encouraged to remain in Mexico throughout the processing of the asylum application. No longer are they allowed to enter the US during this pending period. In addition to that, we're also seeing a ban on asylum processes as a whole, and this is particularly impacting individuals appearing at the southern border. And in connection with that, we've also seen immediately the shutdown of the CBP One app. This is the application that allowed individuals to apply for asylum applications within the US and also allowed them to enter the US as well while pending the application process. So all that has been canceled, and we've also seen a broad scale cancellation of pending asylum applications as well. So naturally, this leaves a lot of migrants in a little bit of a limbo state while we await adjudication and review of a lot of these processes going on. Some of the additional things we're also seeing are a 3-month ban on the refugee resettlement. And one of the more important things is an overall comprehensive immigration review of all immigration policies. Now, this is one that I really want to take a moment to stress because it's probably going to be one of the ones that impacts a broader variety of the topics that I'll be covering today. And more importantly, the executive order is known as the Protecting the United States from Foreign Terrorists and Other National Security and Public Safety Threats. Certainly a mouthful, and it covers a wide range of different topics that the government wants to keep a close eye on. But specifically, that executive order looks to do a few different things. The key provisions that we'll be keeping an eye on are the efforts to reestablish a new uniform baseline for screening and vetting of immigration standards. And specifically, what they talked about is looking to try to increase the vetting and screening standards to the maximum possible degree. Specifically, what they're citing is that they look to try to bring back the vetting standards that were in effect within the US government as of January 19th, 2021. So when this current administration was last in effect, that's really the goal of what the company is trying to aim towards, and really trying to make sure that they're screening to a higher degree than they used to be at this time. Additionally, the government wants to identify high-risk countries, as well as high-risk foreign nationals from those countries who have already been admitted to the US. Now, the goal of that really is going to be reviewing the admission and screening policies from those countries, and really looking to potentially partially suspend or fully suspend travel from those countries if they find that the vetting standards are not up to par with what the government currently wants at this time. This could potentially lead to the door to possible travel bans from various countries or various regions, but we'll have to see where exactly the government looks to go from here. Lastly, the government's also doing a pretty comprehensive review where they want the heads of various state departments, heads of intelligence agencies, and the head of Department of Homeland Security to prepare a report within the next 30 days, outlining all the various policies and procedures that are currently in place and opening each one of those up to additional review. So definitely a lot of comprehensive things to go over regarding the executive orders that are coming in. And I think it's important to remember as a starting point that the immigration standard for applications going forward and for all cases generally is known as the preponderance of the evidence standard. Now, without getting too into the weeds on this, what really the government and officers looking at cases want to see is that the information that's presented to them comes to them and is essentially more or less 51% more true than it is not. So essentially, if the officer believes that the evidence being provided to them is 51% or more accurate than not, they should go ahead and approve that case. Under the new administration, what we're likely to see is that as they begin to reestablish a new uniform baseline, that 51% or more standard is unlikely to change. However, the information and the guidance that officers use to review these cases will likely change going forward. This also takes us into on-site inspections. And if you've been tracking anything regarding the news for US immigration news as of late, we've already seen that Immigration Customs Enforcement and Customs Border Patrol have already stepped up their enforcement efforts. We're already starting to see some raids on migrant communities, and some of these individuals are being subjected to expedited removal from the US as well. So certainly an ongoing situation that we're currently tracking. As it relates to the business community, we're also seeing a significant increase in on-site visits. So this was beginning to happen towards the end of 2024 and certainly already happening at the beginning of 2025, where companies specifically out of San Francisco and New York are noting increased on-site inspection visits from immigration officers. Now, this can come in a couple of different varieties. This could be on-site inspections for the actual worksite locations that are expected of these employees, but we're also getting reports that individuals are receiving on-site inspection visits at their personal homes, especially if employees are working remotely, or at third-party work sites if companies are having employees work at third-party locations as well. So officers are certainly in full force trying to make sure that employees are working in alignment with the provisions of their work authorized status here in the US. Now, to try to round this out with some good news, there have been some recent reforms regarding high-skilled talent here in the US, specifically as it relates to the temporary O1 visa, the extraordinary ability visa, and the long-term green card process known as the national interest waiver. Really what we've been seeing here is a positive shift towards the greater inclusivity of various bits of evidence. For the O1 visa, we're starting to see an increase in exclusivity from STEM degree fields, as well as a greater utilization of evidence to support the petition. So this could be the notoriety of the company or the broadness and awareness of a company being imparted onto an employee. Or it could be that the notoriety or reputation of a specific employee could be used to bolster the application for a particular business that an employee might be looking to start in the US. So that's definitely a great benefit for O1 applications. For green card applications, we're seeing more or less the same thing, but essentially the government's more keen to allow information such as an individual's ownership interest, substantial investments that the company might be already receiving or planned on receiving through venture capitals or angel investors, a company's involvement in either incubators or accelerator programs or such, and obvious growth metrics. All that can be used to really substantiate green card applications going forward, which is always going to be a benefit here. I do want to caveat that obviously with the recent introduction of these executive orders, a lot of this is always going to be subject to change, but at the moment, a lot of these high-level visas do seem somewhat immune from this process. I'm happy to move on to the next slide. So when it comes to skilled labor, obviously we'd like to talk about the stricter eligibility requirements and the increased competition. And specifically what that relates to here is the H-1B visa. Now, for anybody not already familiar with the H-1B visa, it is a particularly difficult visa to come by, mainly because the H-1B requires admission into the H-1B cap lottery. So as some people here might be already familiar with, the H-1B visa, the government allows up to 85,000 of these H-1B visas every year. 20,000 are set aside for those with U.S. master's degrees, and 65,000 are reserved for individuals who hold at least a bachelor's degree or the U.S. equivalent of a bachelor's degree. Now, in fiscal year 2024, there was about 758,000 applications for that lottery process. So as you can imagine, with only 85,000 visas available, the numbers become increasingly more difficult year over year as employers begin to utilize this process. With some recent regulation changes, the H-1B process is now more keenly focused on an employee's passport number, which has certainly reduced the number of duplicate applications for the H-1B process. Thankfully, this has brought the registration numbers down quite a bit. As of fiscal year 2025, the most recent lottery process that passed, we saw about 442,000 applications for the lottery visa this past year. So still a substantial amount of individuals applying for a limited number of visas, and this represents about a 24.8% selection rate on visas as a whole. So from the legal community, our recommendation generally is and always has been, if an employee doesn't already have an H-1B visa, the recommendation is to go ahead and loop them into the lottery process. There's no guarantee that they'll actually be selected for the lottery since they are difficult to come by, and there's no guarantee that those visas will also be approved on their behalf. So it's always worth it to apply for the H-1B when possible. Additionally, some of the things we're also tracking are the high prevailing wages as they relate to these H-1Bs. Now, for those of you who might be aware, the H-1Bs are specifically tied to a prevailing wage, meaning that the Department of Labor sets specific wages that employers must meet in order to hire individuals into these positions. Since the Department of Labor wages are backwards looking, typically by about 3 years, the wage levels are unordinarily high right now. Because of that, there's a higher likelihood that companies might not be willing to sponsor individuals for various H-1B positions, particularly if wage rates continue to remain high. Though, as they begin to progress, wage rates will naturally come down over the next few years. There's no executive orders at this time for the changes to the H-1B process, and the legal community is closely watching to see if there's going to be a possible broadening of the H-1B visa allowances. But at this time, there doesn't seem to be any changes besides just general chatter, and there's no changes at this moment to the H-1B cap lottery process. This brings us into delays for processing times and visa solutions. So we might actually be able to go back one slide on this one. So with regards to delays in processing times and visa solutions, one of the things we like to talk about is obviously ever since COVID has not been as such of a major concern. Most U.S. consulates globally have opened up for visa processing. However, the two most favorable ones we deal with, Canada and Mexico, are still a little bit difficult to obtain appointments by. So global mobility teams are still struggling to get proper visa stamping appointments out of these two countries. Canada has certainly limited availability for appointments. Some consulates only allowing scheduling for emergency appointments. And Mexico is also difficult in the sense that it only allows individuals who have Mexican nationality to schedule appointments at this time, continuing to make it difficult. One of the reasons why we wanted to bring this up is because as the new executive orders begin to become a little bit more commonplace, we fully expect that administrative processing, the additional security check to obtain these visas, will continue to increase. As a quick rundown on administrative processing, this is an additional security check that can happen on any request for visa stamps at any time, regardless if the visa is already approved for that individual. And it's the security check that can happen to take anywhere between 2 to 3 weeks on the shorter end or upwards of 6 to 8 months on the longer end. I'll have a little bit more detail on this on the other side of a different slide, but just wanted to make everyone aware that the executive orders that we're seeing are likely to increase the amount of administrative processing security checks at US consulates globally. Now, as it relates to immigrant visa case processing, we're also going to recommend that individuals be wary of applications that go out for USCIS review, mainly because we are going to expect a higher rate of requests for evidence on these cases. A good metric to look back on is 2019 as a year when this prior administration was at the height of its powers in terms of government pushback on immigration cases. Some data to take away from this is that in 2019, the percentage of initially denied cases for initially filed applications was about 24.6%. So a quarter of applications that were initially submitted to the government were flat out denied without any chance for rebuttal or additional feedback. Of those cases that were submitted, 60% received a request for evidence. So over half the cases that were submitted received an additional request for evidence by the government, even if the applications were more or less evidentiarily complete. And of those cases that received a request for evidence and were responded to by legal practitioners, 61.5% of those cases were approved. So there was an incredibly high rate of government pushback and an equally high incredible rate of government denials as well. In 2019, this was the highest year for denials as a whole. So for immigration cases, for green cards, and for standard non-immigrant work processes, we saw a high peak of 21% among all case types. So a good way to think about that is that 1 in 5 cases that were submitted to the government were effectively denied that year. So recent executive orders suggest that immigration review of regulations will have us trending back towards these numbers. And something to also consider is that as the government begins to review a lot of these processes, premium processing, the mechanism for expedited review of these cases, will likely also disappear. So it's important for a global mobility team to think about long-term planning for what case processing might look like with the removal of premium processing. Quickly, I'll touch base on this last bullet point here, innovative businesses versus antiquated laws. Now, immigration law is always playing catch up to what the business community's needs are. And the Department of Labor, which sets up the standards for the PERM labor certification process, the critical first stage in the green card process overall. As these companies begin to work and navigate the executive orders as it relates to the Department of Labor's processes, we expect that there's going to be some pushback on the Department of Labor processes as a whole, whether that's additional audits in the form of PERM applications or just flat out denials on PERM applications. These processes are already known to be rather time intensive. At the moment, my firm is currently quoting anywhere between 2.5 to 3 years to navigate the PERM process comfortably. So it's very likely that additional denials or audits on these processes are going to extend that time period out by either between 6 to 8 months or even longer if the cases are ultimately denied. We can push to the next slide now. And lastly, what we'd like to briefly discuss today is the idea of heightened compliance under a new administration. Now, naturally, with a lot of these executive orders and government challenges, it's going to be important to make sure that companies are staying on top of the information that they have for their employees, but also providing support to their employees in a way that's meaningful and obviously easy to enable based on technology. So we do tend to recommend that ensuring your team has access to compliance documents as a whole in a centralized platform when possible. This could either be by working with a tech-enabled legal provider as a great option if you're not already doing so, but at all times, knowing where to keep and have access to the relevant documents for employees. Specifically, as this relates to H-1B employees, this could be keeping access to the public access files, and not only just having access to them, but keeping them up to date with any changes that your employees might be dealing with. And additionally, being wary of on-site inspections and having a company plan in place. So this is definitely going to impact employees that are working on-site at a company office, but also those working remotely, as I mentioned before. So this could be working remotely at home or working remotely at third-party work sites. So your team should ideally have an action plan for essentially if these employees are impacted. So this is who's going to be contacted if an officer shows up either at your company doorstep or at the employee's home. Do you have an attorney or an HR representative on hand who's going to be able to facilitate the conversation with this immigration officer? And lastly, how much will your company actually participate in the inspection process? Different companies have different level of allowances in terms of how much they might want that officer to inspect the work site, inspect the employee's home, or provide any information related to that. So it's going to be important to have a conversation on that point. As it relates to building
sorry to interrupt, but that was actually, that's a good point to just ask a follow-up question there where I would just love to also get Carolyn's and Sharon's take on, because I think depending on like where you are at the scale in terms of remote versus like fully in office, because I think like that then of course is adding complexity. And I think like then theoretically for an officer to like visit, like where do they visit, etc., like how to organize that and like how to keep track, like for a non-US immigration specialist like me, would of course like love to hear from Carolyn and Sharon, like also how your organizations have been doing that. And then like afterwards, Dennis, maybe as well, like what you are seeing, because I think like that's one that at least for me sounds very complex. Sharon, do you maybe want to go first? Or Carolyn, sorry.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that's very daunting, honestly, Hannah. I think for sort of smaller from the perspective of a smaller company that has been scaling internationally and sort of scaling to the US, with not a sort of, haven't been a large, well-established corporate. So far, we have not had any on-site inspections. So we, as a company, don't have that sort of experience of dealing with them. I think we have been prepared for them in other locations as well. We've had the same questions come up in the UK, actually, where our employees were all working remotely. And so we were well aware in that case that there could be some on-site inspections at their homes as well. But I think it's a whole other thing to sort of have to say to your employees, your home may be visited. I think that's quite, I mean, quite terrifying for the employees, actually. And so how to best prepare for that? I mean, yeah, that's something that we would need to tackle. And as Dennis is saying, like have a really good plan in place for, who would be there to support, how, does someone from the HR team actually need to be physically present and be there as well? I think we would want to understand, how much warning would we have if that type of inspection occurred. So yeah, there's a lot to sort of unpack around that. And I think we would go through that very carefully with our immigration lawyers when applying for the visa to understand at what point in the process that would occur and, what can we do to be ready for it. But yeah, very daunting.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that you can be proactive about, right? To your point, Sharon, I mean, I haven't received an on-site visit in quite a long time, but now it's almost time to dust off the the on-site instructions that we've had in place in the past. And knowing that we foresee an increase in these, is it something where you partner with your law firm and your immigration attorneys to roll out some training and a refresher to your HR business partners and your site leaders to say, hey, if this happens, here's what you do. Here's a one page or a document, right, that you can reference that has who you need to call and how you need to respond and what you need to do, and offering similar information to the employees that you're sponsoring as well, so that they're not taken off guard and they're not afraid, right? You are preparing them with the information, even if it's to say, if someone knocks at your door, call me, right? Like, here's my contact information, and our global mobility team will walk you through the process, right? So I think now is a time to be proactive, right? And to prepare and to provide that training and information to whoever you have on site, right? Like we have multiple sites across the US. So how to deliver that and get the information in the hands of the right people so they know what to do and who to call.
Yeah. Thank you. Dennis, would love to also hear from you, like what you've seen there, like maybe any other tips and tricks.
Yeah, we've definitely seen on-site visits, especially over the past year. We fully expect on-site visits to continue in a deeper capacity in the next year with the incoming administration. But in terms of on-sites, whether it's going to be at the work site or an employee's home address, everyone's always a little caught off guard, especially when it happens. And sometimes, especially if a plan is not in place, nobody really knows who to call or what documents need to be pulled together. So as my colleagues were mentioning, obviously having a plan in place is absolutely going to be critical. And particularly when officers show up at the work site, and more importantly, if nobody is there to receive the officer, that also can be imputed onto the company as well. And I mean that from recent experience where a company was within a location that they said they were at, the employees were working where they said they were, but for whatever reason, the officer couldn't get past the initial layer of security within the building to make that confirmation. And just because they weren't able to actually access the building and confirm the information they needed to, they issued something known as a NOR, essentially a notice of intent to revoke. So this individual already had work authorization within the US, and just purely on the basis that the officer couldn't meet with that individual face-to-face or meet with their managers, they instinctively already wanted to revoke that individual's work authorized status. So in responding to these government requests and challenges, something to think about is that they're also under no specific obligation to respond within a set time frame either. So how you respond to the government officers is your really one shot to make sure that your employee has the proper credentials in place and work authorization details set up properly. But also what's a little concerning is that the government oftentimes doesn't even respond to your submissions, and they will just kind of leave you in limbo for an extensive period of time, causing both the company and the employee to be essentially on guard for the remainder of that employee's work authorized time, essentially trying to make sure that everything is looking good, they're working where they say they need to be working, they're doing the job that they say they are doing, and essentially just puts everyone into a little bit more of a heightened state for an extensive period of time. Never a fun position to be in. So having a plan in place behind all this will alleviate a lot of these concerns.
Yeah. Thank you, Dennis. No, and also I know that previously I cut you off. Apologies for that. One of the other points that was on the slide, I think like that was super interesting to touch on, is like around how to build scalable programs in global mobility with all those changes. And I think like one of the biggest things like that will change is, of course, like the changes to the H-1B program. So we'd love to also hear from the panelists, like your view on like how will the changes to the program affect like talent acquisition and the way that companies think about what they're doing, but also on the other hand, like how can organizations stay competitive in securing H-1Bs, or like also maybe other visa routes? Carolyn, maybe starting with you this time.
Sure. I think given the challenges that we will see with H-1Bs, right, whether it's the cap, whether it's prevailing wages, whether it's just longer processing times, I think we will start to see companies getting a little bit more selective about what type of roles they are actually sponsoring, right? Because when you're sponsoring someone for an H-1B visa, you want to make sure they have the best chance to have that visa approved, to have that visa extended, and then to eventually get a green card, right? Which is another hurdle, right, that we have to go through with our sponsored employees. So I think you're going to start to see, and I can say we've already done this, is getting a little bit more selective with the types of roles that we are looking to sponsor someone for, and are these roles that lend themselves to potentially other visa options, right? So if an H isn't going to work, could we try for an O1? Could we try for a TN, right? Depending on their nationality. So I think we're going to start to see more kind of formal sponsorship policies, sponsorship guidelines that provide a little bit more rigor around the types of roles that a company sponsors, right? So that you do have the best chance at getting someone a visa and then keeping them work authorized and eventually giving them a path towards permanent residency.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, do you want to add?
Yeah, totally agree, Caroline. And I think, where I've often seen H-1Bs used is actually with probably a younger generation of talent coming into the workforce, where you have foreign students in the US and you're trying to sort of secure the best graduates coming into your teams and so on. And particularly because of, as Dennis mentioned, having to go through this lottery process and it not being guaranteed that you will get a place. If you hire a student who already has several years of work authorization left on their visa, then actually it's giving you the best sort of chance to get that lottery place and to make the application. But coming then to Carolyn's point, those candidates may not then be the best ones for actually getting the approvals. Do you want to pay the wage levels required to secure the H-1B to this? If these individuals are completely new to the workforce, will they sort of qualify under stricter criteria and so on? So I think it's definitely going to create a shift, and I think that's the sort of, I guess, population I can see being most impacted by this, sort of younger foreign workers who maybe don't have the levels of experience and so on, to qualify for the O1, although I know we have some of the expanded sort of criteria that Dennis mentioned being considered. But still, I think that will be a real sort of shame and will reduce sort of employment options for that sort of younger generation coming into the workforce.
Yeah.
Well, and just to add real quickly to that, and I almost wonder if we will start to potentially see, just not from an immigration perspective, but just from an overall mobility perspective, are we going to see more international, like rotational development type programs, right? Where we can't sponsor you here in the US, so we're going to put you in, but you're a high potential employee, so we're going to put you on these rotational kind of development assignments so that eventually you get your year outside of the US, right? And if the goal is to have you employed in the US long term, we bring you back on an L. So I'm wondering if we'll start to see a shift even with our talent management programs here in the US to accommodate for some of those issues that we might be seeing.
Yeah, it's a super interesting point, because also like back in 2019, I was also in the US back then, like as part of an accelerator program, and I remember that there, like the talent mobility into Canada was massively changed, like just by what happened in the US. And so that is something that I also personally find fascinating. And maybe Dennis, now for you, the question, like also generally your take on like, how will things shift like between different visa categories, and especially with the twist of like, from an outsider perspective, it seems that under the new administration, there's still two very different viewpoints on migration, immigration, skilled migration in general. So it doesn't seem that there's 100% like clarity yet, but we'd love to hear your take and like also where you see things shift.
So I completely agree with my colleagues on this panel today. Obviously, the considerations that the legal community is going to be looking at are obviously, are the individuals that companies are sponsoring going to be a good fit for the roles that they're looking to hire for? And as Carolyn mentioned, companies are going to be more increasingly looking at the health of the immigration program, especially if a lot more cases are going to be adjudicated under a higher level of scrutiny. Companies are going to be less willing to submit cases, especially if individuals have degrees that are not as properly aligned, which is really unfortunate because, especially in the environment that we're slowly entering, positions such as a software engineer by individuals who have a computer science degree or even a software engineering degree will still be challenged on the same grounds as if you had a degree that was not properly correlated. So it's going to be a little bit hard to find a proper medium. So to that end, companies will obviously try to push for the H-1B where they can. I would say a lot more companies are willing to flex different visa types where possible. So Canadians and Mexicans will obviously attempt to utilize the TN1 and TN2 visa where possible. Anybody who is Australian background will certainly leverage the E3 visa when applicable. And Chilean and Singaporean national will obviously use the H-1B1 to good effect as well. The two visas I would say we're obviously seeing a lot more of an uptick on are the O1 visa, which has historically been a very high rate of approval visa. I think that's obviously in connection with the legal community doing such a good job of vetting the applicants who we submit into that visa category to make sure that the standards continue to remain high. And additionally, we're seeing a growth of the E2 visa as well. So this is our treaty trader visas for individuals who have companies in the US with a nationality of a treaty company to the US. And those companies essentially are allowed to transfer employees from those countries to their specific company here in the US under the idea that they're working for a similar nationality company. A little bit more of a nuanced visa, but we're definitely seeing a lot more broad acceptance and utilization of these visas, especially as it relates to short-term work authorization and future preparation for long-term green card processes as well.
That's super interesting. And maybe Anna also like shifting into how kind of like secondary effects, because I think, of course, like talent shortages, labor shortages like are still there with fewer people potentially coming in. I think like that is going to be a real issue. And so there are also kind of like implications for global mobility professionals, like how to deal with that. Would love to hear everyone's take on that. Like for specific jobs, will it mean that like there's more temporary workers coming in? Like what are other mitigation strategies to still ensure that there's enough talent that a company has to employ? Carolyn, maybe starting with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely the question of will, at least in the US, will you go to more of a temporary workforce, right? Will you be looking for more temporary labor? But to that point, even when you look at temporary labor or contract labor, a lot of those individuals may be here on a visa, right? So, that it could be an option. Where I see potential, growth just in terms of overall strategy would be, well, if we can't hire the talent here in the US, right, because we can't get a visa, or we just, the US workforce doesn't have the skills, are we going to see companies doing more of an offshore nearshore model, right, where we are looking to employ individuals outside of the US to do those jobs, you know, whether it is through consulting partnerships or PEO providers, or whether it is looking to hire directly, right, through your other locations outside of the US, if you are more of a global company with, you know, legal entities outside of the US. So I think you might start to see a shift of that, where I am interested in seeing what happens is not so much with the highly skilled labor, but as we look at our more of our blue collar, you know, for lack of a better term, our blue collar labor, you know, our hourly production type roles, right, where you saw the executive order that came out, where now we're looking at TPS going away and some of the humanitarian parole programs going away. So what does that do to that workforce, and how do you know, how do programs prepare for that? And that's where I think you're really going to start to see more of a shift towards maybe the temporary labor to fill those roles more immediately before we can look to staff up on a more permanent basis.
Yeah, thank you. Sharon, what is your point of view?
Yeah, fully agree with Carolyn that that's probably going to be the more tricky sort of area with those more hands-on roles. I think with a lot of professional roles, particularly now that people are much more used to working remotely and so on, actually, you know, thinking from my company perspective, we probably would be looking to hire, if it feels too difficult to get an appropriate visa route in the US, then we would look to hire outside the US instead. You know, Swedish immigration is relatively straightforward, quick. So, you know, we would see no issues with relocating someone to Sweden, even if they were in the US initially, and hiring them there, or hiring locally in one of the other countries where we have entities. I think I would, and you know, certainly if you need, as Carolyn mentioned, if you want that sort of closer team working in the same time zone and so on as well, you know, are you going to set up an entity somewhere closer by and in the same time zone where actually you can hire as an alternative? So yeah, I think we, particularly for smaller companies where, you know, you know, there's going to be a lot of challenges with these new rules and the increased scrutiny and so on, and the increased cost and so on. I think it would be harder to push through a business case to hire in the US versus one of these other locations, you know, in the sort of current environment. So from a short-term perspective, that's how I see that we would sort of fix that.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dennis, maybe also for your perspective, because of course, like you have insights into different companies. I do think there is, of course, the aspect of like how many locations does the company already have? Does it maybe like have them initiate in more international locations and like globalization earlier, or not? But also, of course, like there's always like the cost and like feasibility of work. Like if your work is like very tied to location, that's more difficult. But would love to hear your take and like what you've seen maybe for different kinds of organizations as well.
Of course. So naturally, the size and scope of the companies really kind of dictates what options they have available to them. A lot of our companies that are primarily US based or don't have much of a global presence obviously have a little bit more of a difficult time sourcing international talent, especially really preparing them for the international transfers. As Carolyn and Sharon were mentioning, utilization of the L1 intra-company transfer visa for companies that are internationally known is definitely certainly going to be easier. Hiring them at a location internationally for at least a period of 1 year before they transfer over to the US serves as a great option for temporary work in the US, but also sets these employees up for great avenues for navigating the long-term green card process. However, for companies that are not as broad in their awareness, most of the time we see them utilizing, I guess they would refer to them as like third-party contracts at within their home countries to be able to be work authorized. So employer of record type businesses. This is companies such as Deal, where they are getting work through a third-party company, but the work authorization is derived from wherever that employee is currently situated. So they're not necessarily an employee of the company, which creates some additional hurdles from the immigration perspective, but certainly clears up the short-term work-related issues. Where we're also slowly likely to see some additional challenges as it relates to work is employees who are currently work authorized in the US, but for whatever reason, traveling internationally. We saw this last time around where individuals were stuck through administrative processing checkpoints, attempting to get their required travel documents, and would be stuck for extensive periods of time, ultimately requiring the companies in the US to terminate those US positions. Then at that point, we would need to figure out where these employees are essentially going to work. Now, again, if the companies are pretty large and broad in their awareness, as Carolyn and Sharon have mentioned, transferring them internationally is typically a lower issue in terms of getting them reworking with the company. However, if the companies are not that broad in their awareness, this could ultimately mean losing out on some great talent just because of the inability to obtain the required travel documents.
Yeah, thank you. Also generally, I think like the further looking into impacts, like when we look at travel bans, I think like you also initially mentioned them in your deep dive. Would love to hear from everyone. How should companies prepare for possible reinstatement of travel bans? What are you thinking the impact will be, and like what to maybe already put in place to prepare for that? Sharon, do you may want to get started?
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's the key thing is communication and, keeping your employees aware as things develop. I think you just need to, it's useful to have a good awareness of your population and know, which, how many are likely to be impacted by potential travel bans, and just sort of stay close to them, continue to give them advice. I think we would also be preparing for, possible scenarios and what happens if people are stranded. To what extent is the company going to support that individual if you've given them advice not to travel and they've traveled anyway, and then they are outside the US for some unspecified amount of time? Are you paying for their hotel bills for that entire period? Are you, these sorts of questions are the sort of practicalities which I think it's really useful to prepare for. But I would certainly be erring on the side of caution. And if we start to get a hint of bans that will come out, or as soon as they're known, I would be rapidly putting comms out to employees and just making sure that they are fully prepared and know what to expect, and that there's potentially a discussion with their manager as well if they've decided to travel anyway about whose sort of responsibility that is. Yeah.
Thank you, Carolyn.
And I agree with everything. I think, to prepare is to figure out how proactive can you be, find out where all of your people are, where are they traveling? Can you connect in with your travel department, or your enterprise security team, or whoever's monitoring travelers, whether they're traveling. Often we deal with employees who are sponsored that are traveling personally, right? But then you also have your business travelers and people that are traveling for the company for work. So, how do you get a handle on where everyone is, and how to get in touch with them? And then to Sharon's point, have a contingency plan. Obviously make sure that you're communicating with everyone, but have a contingency plan. If you do end up having employees who are grounded in a certain country, can you put them on an unpaid leave? Do you have to terminate them, right? And have them work as a contractor through a partner in that location? Can you transfer them to, one of your entities? So just trying to kind of come up with kind of all of your options in the event you do have someone who's grounded for whatever period of time, and making sure the businesses are aware of that as well. That, hey, if we have people that are traveling, we may need to look at, right, X, Y, and Z if a ban goes into place and we have impacted employees.
Yeah. And it's an interesting point, because I think especially for organizations that have either hybrid model or fully remote, and then making sure that you keep track of employees' locations. I think like by now, a lot of employees have that awareness that for a company to know, like even if you spend an additional day after your holidays, like where you work from another location, that is something that the company absolutely needs to be aware of. But I think like those are just like things where now, like making sure that you have a system where you can track all of that, like making sure that you train employees as well, like what can happen like if they don't do that. I think there's again like a lot of communication, tracking, etc. Involved. But it's interesting because I do think like the fact of like making sure that employees understand and are on board. So yeah, also again, like Dennis, would love to hear your take, and like also maybe things that you've seen there that work like in organizations of like how they prepare the employees, and like what your suggestions would be.
Yes. Obviously, like my panelists were talking about, having a policy or having open lines of communication with your mobility team is critically important here. We ask a lot of the same questions that we just previously covered. So, who is going to cover the cost of transportation? And again, is this going to cover cost of transportation to a U.S. consulate the employee is selecting, or has the company already narrowly predefined U.S. consulates that are approved for travel to? Who's going to be covering lodging? Are family member costs going to be covered as part of that? What travel locations will be covered for visa stamping? And obviously having that open conversation about what happens in the event of administrative processing delays. What is the company's current remote work policy? Will the company allow the employee to work internationally for any period of time? And one of the things that's often not as openly discussed is what happens regarding global tax implications. If the employee has to work internationally for any period of time, like, has that already been settled? Really covering a lot of these questions in advance before an employee is potentially stuck internationally is going to be great, just to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row. But more importantly, just having an idea of what are the high risk areas as well. So just off the top of my head, I know we would like to typically identify China, India, and the Middle East as sensitive areas where travel to these countries or requesting visa stamping from these countries has notoriously triggered administrative processing delays. And just as a reminder, these delays can be as short as 2 to 3 weeks, but we've also seen anecdotal evidence where they've been upwards of 6 to 8 months as well. So as Carolyn was mentioning, is there an effective leave policy in place? Is there an effective policy to rehire this employee when they have work authorization again? Or is the company potentially just losing out on that great talent? So a lot of different things to cover here.
Yeah, thank you. And it's interesting because, of course, like right now, there's some things that are potentially already to expect, because like we've seen changes from the administration before when they went term initially. And I think like that's for me an interesting question in terms of long-term strategies, because now it feels like we partially know what we're getting into. Like at least we have some ideas, which of course in the last term it was a bit harder, but would love to take get everyone's view there, because on one hand it seems like, okay, we know potentially what we're getting into, but like still, because of what I mentioned initially, that it is not 100% clear like where the administration stands on it, because there's those two different kind of like sectors. Is it still like rather that there's no long-term view or like strategy implemented yet, because potentially it will, like the situation will be slightly better than what we've seen before? Or is it already like, okay, we're rather like preparing for the worst case and like already putting those long-term strategies in place, similar to like Carolyn, what you mentioned with like potentially having the more junior employees move to other countries and like then have them return. Of course, like just as far as you can talk about it, but I think like that's also interesting for people who are listening in today. Sharon, maybe for you to start.
Yeah, I think if I'm looking at this from the perspective of a scale-up organization, probably we are not going to put in place long-term strategies around this. The company strategy changes so often, and what the priorities are anyway, that there would just almost be no point doing that. I mean, if I was thinking about it from the perspective of a more established company, I think you might be looking at, how can you sort of upskill your US teams if you've been relying on foreign talent before. These exactly as we discussed before, these alternative strategies of maybe relocating people first to get the L1 authorization and so on. I mean, I think for me, what would be, again, the most disruptive with all of these changes and this administration is just the delays and the length of time that it is going to take to get approvals. We are always under a lot of pressure to get things done quickly. When we decide that we want to go live with a project or something needs to happen, there's always a lot of pressure to get things done and get people to where they need to be straight away. So that's going to be the biggest challenge I think that I would face, managing expectations within the business. And where you have like, I can think, for example, where we've had shorter term project needs and we have an expert team based in Sweden and we want to get them to the US to support on a particular project or a customer deployment. And actually, it's by the time we've got visas in place for those individuals, the project's finished or we've missed the whole. So that's where I can anticipate the sort of biggest problem. So I think if I had to sort of say that we need longer term and better strategies, it would be to plug the gaps with those project-based deployments? How can we cover them in a better way? Can we, you know, in advance, could the US team actually come and spend time in Sweden with the team here? You know, so as I said, upskilling the US team elsewhere so rather than sending the Swedish team to the US, can we send the US team to Sweden, upskill them and then send them back again? Or, you know, what US citizens do we have in our Swedish population? You know, these are all the sorts of questions that we would start to ask, I think.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carolyn.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're definitely going to see, you know, a lot more policy review and looking at the processes that companies are currently going through when it comes to sponsoring employees, what types of employees are sponsoring. I mean, looking at what happened the first time around, I think companies can prepare, right? I think in a way we are preparing for worst case scenario and having that information in our back pocket, right? We don't want to go at our businesses and cause unnecessary concern if nothing does happen, but we do want to take a proactive approach and do what we can, right? Whether it's determining where our travelers are sitting or determining how many EAD holders do we have, right? That are here on TPS or F1 students, right? You know, what can we do as a team proactively to best set ourselves up for success, or at least, you know, give the company a fighting chance to address some of the challenges if and when, right? When and if, right? They do come up. So I think it is, you know, taking a look at your policies and your programs, but also kind of looking at what happened the first time around,
Yeah.
and being as proactive as you can, but, you know, kind of holding on enacting anything until we know for sure. So just trying to prepare as much as possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Dennis, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I was also just going to say, I think another focus area would just be making sure that your all of your immigration processes and record keeping and everything is just very sort of tight and compliant. I think that's something that would probably like help me feel better about the situation. If I can just review everything and feel like you're well prepared, so that if, you know, when the inevitable challenges come and so on, that you can address them and that you're still sort of maintaining good reputation with the authorities and so on. That would be something that I feel like we can do now and we know is going to be useful.
Yeah, thank you. Dennis, instead of having you answer the question as well, I have like one from the Q&A for you, which is like, do we need to do anything differently for when team members come to our US offices temporarily for like 1 to 2 weeks?
Great question. Obviously, we've definitely been seeing a lot of that going on where individuals are just trying to get to the US, not necessarily for projects that they're working on, sometimes just to meet up with other team members or just do some information sharing, maybe some trainings. So for that end, under the previous administration, we were already seeing some government pushback in terms of the B1 visa for business investors or team members coming to the US. I would only anticipate that's only going to increase going forward. So individuals who are looking to try to bring employees here to the US for brief trainings or meetups with other team members really need to focus on a couple different things. One is meeting the evidentiary requirements. I think that's particularly with the B visa, it becomes one of those things where individuals think, you know, I'm just visiting for a short time. How much information do I really need to bring to bear for these applications? And it's oftentimes, especially if you're going for business purposes, that information skews a little bit higher than you would think. Oftentimes, the government wants to see what exactly are the projects that you're intending on working on in the US, not necessarily working on, but being involved in the US, what trainings will you be taking part in? And to that end, sometimes the government also wants to know what might be the impact of the company if this specific employee is not allowed to travel to the US. They also want to see what essentially is going to be the economic harm here. So being able to establish all of that with documented evidence from the company, either in the form of slide decks, training materials that the company would need to share. And this could also be evidence in the form of what exactly is tying that specific employee to their home country. Now, under the previous administration, we weren't seeing this too much, but it was still a prevalent issue. Under the current administration, I would only imagine that's going to increase further, where the government will want to see what exactly are the ties this specific employee has to their home country. Can they establish that they'll actually return back home? So this could include buying or working with that employee to obtain return travel flight information. That way they already have that secured before they depart their own country. Having information such as bank account information or pay statements ready to show that this employee is actively earning an income within their home country, that they have friends and relationships within their home country that they expect to return to. All of this can kind of seem like mundane information, but really when pulled into totality, really helps to make for easier B1 visitor visas to the US.
Yeah, thank you so much. And looking at the time, we're already at the end. We still have so many questions that we didn't get to, but I think we covered a lot of ground. Maybe we just have to do a second version of this webinar. So wanted to say a big thank you to all my panelists. I think this has been very, very insightful. I hope that also for all the other participants, it has been insightful. Thanks everyone for joining. Yeah, Nuran also says we have to do a part 2, so stay tuned for that. And otherwise, I wish everyone a great rest of the day or the evening, depending on which time zone they're in. Up until the next time. Bye-bye.